because these are seen as somehow incompatible. And furthermore, it's worth noting that in the higher education context in general, there is an expectation that well-educated people are not likely to be religious themselves. Of course, this is not a universal rule, and there's no mechanism for policing such a rule or expectation. But I caught myself noticing this about a year ago when I was talking with a student from Dartmouth College, which is a small liberal arts college not far from where I live. And he was telling me about how he had recently taken an interest in fundamentalism. And I assumed that his interest, just automatically I found myself assuming that his interest was a scholarly one. And I caught my own prejudice in this, and the notion that somebody would openly declare their interest in fundamentalism would have to be a scholarly interest, because of course they wouldn't admit that in a scholarly context that they are interested in fundamentalist Christian religion as their own system of belief. I think of myself as a pretty liberal person with a broad view and a rather open view towards religion in general, but still, even with my own openness, I found that the general context that the university creates limits our possibilities for thinking about how one might approach religion, and limits, puts a preference to the distanced approach, the approach that sets you apart from that religion and treats religion as an object that's distant from you. Of course, in the Soviet context, this divide is even greater. And I was just in St. Petersburg, for example, talking with a group of people about Islam, and it was quite clear to me that what was natural for those students and faculty members, they were primarily sociologists, but what was natural for them was to think about Islam as an object that you either sort of try to cut through, that is, to look at what's really going on instead of what people say about what they're doing. So if somebody says that they're a strong believer, then you want to know, well, what is their political agenda? What is the motivation, for example, because of poverty or something like that, as opposed to simply accepting that they believe because they think it's important and compelling to believe as they do. They also have a very strong tendency to want to count things, to sort of distance themselves from the object of study by turning it into something that can be quantified, as opposed to something that should be approached in terms of the nuances of its meaning for people, how people live that experience, and so on. And this was in one of the more advanced institutions of higher education in St. Petersburg, where you might expect that things would have changed more since Soviet times, but I think this legacy of Soviet approaches remains extremely strong. Finally, I want to talk a bit about the matter of what it means to be a believer and to also be studied, or at least to not necessarily be a believer, but to accept as valid the notion of belief, instead of treating belief as something that is to be explained away, in a sense, explained because of the social background of the person or the political agenda, as I was noting earlier. And there is always a danger when you do this that people will say to you, well, you're not really analyzing, you're just accepting what people say about themselves. So you're taking at face value what religion is as it's presented to you by believers. Now, it's a curious kind of statement if you think about that in the context of how we approach literature. If we think about literature, we don't say, well, what was Dostoevsky really trying to do in this book? Or why did he write this book? He didn't write it just because he had these ideas. He wrote it because he had some kind of social background or was confronting some kind of political problem or something like that. That is, this tendency to try to find another mode of explanation or understanding of what this cultural system, this system of concepts that religion constitutes, is that this is such a strong tendency in relation to religion, but it's not something that we do in relation to other fields of humanities. And another example of this, one can look at, for example, the way that Oriental studies approached Islam as it developed as a field in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And in many ways this parallels the way that religious studies, Bible studies approached the study of the Bible in a somewhat earlier period. Though in the case of Bible studies, this was originally a project of believers, of people who wanted to understand the Bible well. And they started noticing things like, for example, the contradictions between the various books of the New Testament. They have rather different accounts of various events and so on. And so part of their project was to try to explain the differences between these things. And some people consider this to be an anti-religious project, seen as somehow or debunking the Bible, saying that there's this contradiction, so it can't be a valid document, somehow undermining the authenticity or truth value of the religion. But those who were initially engaged in that were really not approaching it from that point of view. They just wanted to get a deeper understanding, and they themselves developed an account, for example, of the way that the Bible developed as a document, the way that the books of the Bible came together, came to be assembled as in their current form, and so on. And analogously, in Islamic studies scholars in the West looked closely at the Quran and tried to figure out how this document came to be in its current form. Of course, the story about the Quran itself is that it was dictated, it was received by Muhammad and then dictated to his followers, and they remembered it and eventually wrote it down. So it was an oral document initially, and then put down on paper. But there are things like about the Quran, for example, the structure of it is not sequential in a chronological sense or even in a logical sense, but it's ordered according to the length of the surahs, which then raises the question, well, in what order were these surahs recorded or conveyed to the believers by Muhammad or whatever? And so this was a project of trying to understand how the religion came to be and worked as a system. And in some ways, this was not that different from what Muslims themselves were doing for many centuries prior to that, as they tried to figure out, especially in the realm of hadith studies, the hadith being the sayings about the Prophet or sayings of the Prophet, which were recorded alongside the Quran and serve as a major source for religious knowledge for Muslims. One of the big projects for Muslim scholars, believers, people who are keen to help build knowledge of the religion, one of their projects was to try to figure out which of the hadith are actually worth giving credit to and which are not. So in a way, it's a very similar kind of project to, and the way they did that was to try to figure out how soon this was recorded after when it was supposedly told, who passed on the knowledge and so on. So they had a rather systematic way of trying to figure out which hadith are worth crediting. And in some ways, this is quite similar to the way that Islamic studies as a field started exploring in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the question of how are the texts that we have, the text that we have in the Quran, how did that come to be? Where does Islamic law come from, and things like that? But the difference, of course, was that when Western scholars were studying this, they were not studying it as believers primarily. In fact, very few exceptions in that early period. And in fact, some of them were actually antagonistic towards the tradition and were themselves Christian and were indeed keen to show that the story that Muslims tell about the Quran is actually not true. For example, that it was recorded maybe generations later or things like that. And this, of course, led to great polemics between scholars who are within the tradition and those who are studying it from the outside. And so we have these interesting divides between the approaches.